All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody to our Healthy Garden Talk today. My name's Keenan. I'm with the City of Albany Parks and Recreation Department. You can find me at the Albany Senior Center. That's my facility. But I love doing all types of things, as well as including different types of activities, as well as just providing the public with as much resources and fun as possible. And that's where Beth and Patricia come in with the Berkeley Garden Club. So I'd like to pass it over to Beth.
Well, I am Beth, and I am a member of the Berkeley Garden Club, and we have been doing these healthy garden talks with the City of Albany since right before COVID happened, which is how we all learned to make a pivot to Zoom. The Berkeley Garden Club is a collection of gardeners of all stripes, from people like me who stick it in the ground and say, I wonder if that'll grow, to others who are very organized and keep notebooks and know exactly what seed they started when and how they planted it and the exact conditions it is. So if you're anywhere on those two extremes, you are more than welcome to join us. I will put our link in the chat box, and I'll ask Keenan if he'll also put the Albany Community Center in the chat box. And we'd like to thank the Albany Community Foundation, who is sponsoring this most recent series of talks. So we invite everybody to check out the Albany Community Center, which has a library and a senior center and all sorts of things, and the Berkeley Garden Club, which does monthly wonderful talks. And today's is a very special one. So I'm going to turn it over to Patricia to introduce our speaker today.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And before I introduce Janet, let me mention that the final program in our series this year will be the second Tuesday in April 11th from 8 to 9. And Elizabeth Vogel, who is an instructor at our community college here in Oakland, is going to talk on using urban spaces to create resilience. So that will be April 11th. But let me introduce Janet. She is a horticulturalist and the curator of the Sunset Western Garden Collection. And for any of you that come to local nurseries, not New York, Colorado, they are the plants are in special green cans, and they are just really prime special plants that I always look for when I go to the nurseries. So Janet is Berkeley based and specializes in low water, regionally appropriate, easy care plants. As the collection's curator, she is responsible for selecting and evaluating which plants are ultimately chosen to carry that Sunset Western Garden Collection label, focusing on replacing thirsty, labor-intensive varieties with colorful, resilient alternatives. She works with breeders, hybridizers, and nurseries all over the world. Her plant collection test garden is featured in the Sunset Western Garden Book of Easy Care Plantings, which I have. Oh, you can't see it. I have it right here. I use it. I have 6 copies of it. And every time I work with a client, that's our beginning. I give them Post-it notes and say, mark every plant that you love in this, and we'll see if we can incorporate it into your garden, because they're all great plants for our area. So, and in person, if you want to see the plants, they're part of the Sunset Test Gardens located at Cornerstone in Sonoma. So Janet, I'm going to let you talk about your genetic background. So I just welcome, and we're so glad you're here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I like to be here. I'm surprised that we have people from all over the country on here. And the beginning of my talk is very general about what pollinators need in a garden. So that's applicable to anyone around the world. But when we talk about plants, they are going to be more specific to the Bay Area, although plant groups and plant categories are worldwide. And that is part of what I talk about when I talk about pollinators, is that we're looking at hyper regional aspects, and we're trying to interpret things from around the world. And we are a global society, both with humans and with insects and with plants. And so I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit of all of that, but I'm going to share my screen so you all can see my PowerPoint here. And well, let's just jump in. So yes, as Patricia alluded to, I am a 6th generation Dutch seed family. My family started breeding vegetable seeds back in the early 1800s in the Netherlands. And the hybridization of the world's food supply really was created with what people were hybridizing, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And when we're looking at pollinators, we're talking about pollinators from whether they're butterflies or bees. We've got little bees, we've got big bees, and birds. And I'm going to incorporate all of those because they're all really fundamental to have in our gardens, and they create so much joy and space and movement and joyfulness. And I really believe that gardening should be joyful. I'm going to steal a little line from Maria Kondo, and I think gardens should spark joy, and the plants that we have in our gardens should spark joy. So I really encourage people to sit in their gardens and be in their gardens, and if there's something in there that you don't like, or that has a disease problem or a pest problem, or is maybe in our area water hog and requires more water, that we think about replacing those with plants that make us happier. And don't keep something in there, and don't be guilty about keeping plants in your garden because you feel like you can't kill a plant or that it's bad. And we have these lovely things called compost bins. We can use them, we can compost and make new fertilizer for the future plants, and have that space be filled with something that really we enjoy more. So one main thing that I'm going to talk about first are pesticides. We've been hearing a lot about pesticide use, especially the neonicotinoids. It's a nice hard word to say there. They're not the only category of pesticide that is out there, but this is probably the nastiest because it's the longest lasting. And we have seen really detrimental effects of this on our insect population. This top link here to the Center for Food Safety, if you go to that, this is a PDF sheet that they have that lists all the retail pesticides that contain neonics. And what neonics are, just a little cheat sheet, is if anything says that it's systemic, that is usually a neonic, or pretty much always a neonic. And what that means is that spray, that chemical, goes into the plant, it cannot be washed off, and it stays in the plant sometimes for years, and it can come out in the pollen and the nectar. If the birds will eat it, it can kill birds, it can kill whatever is going to consume that pollen or nectar. So we're really concerned about this particular class of pesticide. It's not marketed under things like all-in-one or long-lasting, or things that you use once a year. These are very heavily used in agriculture, and unfortunately we cannot maybe make that much of a difference in ag. But I do say, as a community, people have been talking about this more. They've been asking their garden centers if the suppliers are using these types of chemicals or not. It's having an effect. Nurseries are starting to listen. They're starting to hear this. Some states have started to ban it. New Jersey and Maine have banned all neonics. California should be doing this. We should be pushing for our legislatures to be banning this, because 75% of them are being used in ag, and we have really no control over that.
Janet,
We're not seeing your slides.
Oh dear. So
They're
I did share my screen.
Keenan, could it be a setting and you can help Janet with that?
Yeah, let me see what I can do.
Well, we prevailed over the weather, but we can't
Well,
prevail
let's
over
try-
the technology. There we go. Wonderful.
Did
Thank
that
you.
work?
Yeah, we got it now.
There
Everybody
you
can
go.
see?
So that was my screen about my family and the seeds. And then these were my pollinators. You didn't miss much. I'm glad you said something. Thank you for speaking up. So this is what I was going off of right here with this list. So that is on the top, that is the food safety that has the list of everything that's in the retail stores. Because it's still, still 25% of the neonics sold are sold to lawn and garden consumers. And so our neighbors and the people who are gardening in our homes, I always encourage people, if you have services that are coming in and doing landscaping or doing, lawn care or anything like that at your home, that you have this conversation with them. You ask them what chemicals, what pesticides, what herbicides they are using. And if you feel strongly against them, like I do, that you ask them not to use anything, because a lot of these, especially the lawn and garden care companies, they use a lot of this in their, they don't even ask you. This is part of their regular, how they maintain lawns. And so they just go in and they use these chemicals. And once they're in your garden, then you're going to actually kill the pollinators that you're trying to get in. So probably the number one rule about having pollinators in your garden is to try not to kill them once they get there. So really, try to be aware of these things. The other thing that I will say is that pollinators will spread. They don't stay in your garden. They'll go to your neighbor's garden. Some of the bees and butterflies have about a 1 square mile radius that they will travel to get food. And if your neighbors are using these chemicals, or the state or your parks, if they're using those chemicals, those pollinators are going to be picking those up in other areas, and that will have a detrimental effect. We're really fortunate in Berkeley. I think more people are aware of this than in other municipalities. But even in my garden in Berkeley last year, I had bees coming in and dying who were obviously being affected from chemicals. I would have 5 or 6 of them dying at a time. So someone in my neighborhood was using something that was killing off the bees that were in our neighborhood. So if you have, community meetings, or you have any type of community interaction, this is something you might want to bring up and you might want to talk about, because it's really important that we, as a society and as communities, that we kind of are aware of this, and we are aware of what we are using in our gardens. The second thing that is really important and is pretty universal is habitat. So everybody wants to talk about the pretty flowers, but whether it's a bird or a butterfly or bees, they live somewhere and they need a place to live. So most of our native pollinators are actually not colonies, like the honeybee gets a lot of attention, but most of the native bees are solitary bees, and they live underground for the most part, or they live in crevices and in other, like if you have bamboo or you have hollow stems, to leave those out, they can climb into those and live in there, but they need some place to overwinter. A lot of times they hibernate in the wintertime, and it's helpful to have habitat for them. So we're talking, when you're talking about birds and butterflies, we're looking at larger shrubs and small trees. And when we're looking at bees, we're talking about overwintering sites in the ground. So they like leaf litter. They like to have compost piles. They like a little bit of bare ground. So what part of our water wise, if I was giving a water wise talk, I would be talking about mulch and how mulch is good to use on your soil to preserve the water. But we also want to make sure that we leave some areas mulch free, whether that's around your foundation or around paths or someplace where these ground dwelling bees can actually live, because they can't get through all that mulch and get to the ground. So we need to have some open space for them where they can actually get into the soil, because that's where a lot of our bees live. The other types of bee that's kind of interesting right now, the bumblebees are now on the endangered species list for the state of California. And to get them on that list, the environmentalists had to actually classify them as a fish as an invertebrate. So if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole on that one, you can Google that, because it was quite an interesting process to get the bumblebees listed. But it is concerning. We have 26 native bumblebees in the United States and 3 of them in California, and they're now endangered primarily because of the pesticide use. And the people who are suing to overturn that are all the big ag companies, almond, cotton, they're all suing to overturn that for a reason. And we really need to be more aware, I think, of what we're doing to our insects in this world. The other thing I'll say about habitat is you all have a permission to have a messy garden. nature does not make the bed every morning. And part of what we do is we clean up our yards and we clean up all the eggs and all the hibernating insects in that winter time, and we compost them, which is not very helpful. And it's really not helpful. We put them in the regular garbage and it goes to landfill. So what we are trying to tell people to do is in the fall, between the fall and when things warm up. So we're not quite there yet this year. We're still a little chilly. So probably won't be till April or maybe even May, that you leave the leaf litter if possible. You leave as much not groomed in your garden, because the fall is when a lot of butterflies and bees are laying their either dormant or they're laying their eggs, and those eggs can lay dormant and then they hatch when it warms up in the springtime. So if they're laying eggs in the fall and you're sweeping all that stuff up and you're putting it away someplace else in your green waste, you're actually killing off that whole generation of butterflies. So be mindful of that and allow yourself to have a messy garden, have a little bit more time to do other things. Habitat can come in many different ways. This is from the side, my pot pile on the side of my house. This is a Buick Wren right here. This Buick Wren is building a nest underneath this pot. They really like to have things like pots are one of their favorite places to build nests under. So it doesn't have to be anything really fancy. You can have a nice birdhouse for birds that they can come into, but you can also just have some pots at the side of your house and be aware. I watch this bird every year. This is the third year in a row now that this couple has been building a nest here, and it's right outside of my dining room window where I work. And so I can see them, and they're very busy, but they just started this week building this nest again. But this is a form of habitat for birds. The third thing that everyone needs really is a water source. So in times of drought in particular, we've been very good about transferring our irrigation from high impact sprinklers to drip and not having a lot of water, but we're also losing a lot of our creeks and streams and the water sources that we have out in the wild. So if you don't have a water source for your pollinators, they will leave to find water because they're like humans. They need to have water every day. I need a constant supply of water. So smaller insects like your bees and your butterflies, they don't like a real deep pond. Like if you have a swimming pool, you notice that the bees often die because they'll land on the water and they can't get out of it again. So for those types of pollinators, we really recommend a very shallow dish with some rocks or some pebbles or something in it that they can get in and out of the water of. If you're talking about birds, bird baths, they love to play and wash and splash in the water, and birds will come from all over the place to do that. I was just watching crows today jumping in and out of a bin that I have outside for the birds. And that is a good source just to keep in mind. You just need to keep them clean. So like every week, like every Sunday, I go out there and I dump the old water and I put new water in. So I'm not harboring any diseases or any types of mosquitoes or anything like that. That weekly process will eliminate that. But it's really, really important to have water on site. The next thing I'm going to mention are kind of going back and starting to get into the plants is diverse flower shapes and colors. So there's all these bees. We have over 1,000 different types of bees, all the different butterflies. They all like different plants. So some of them have long ways that they like these long, narrow flowers. They like to sip the nectar in out of that. Some like smaller clusters of flowers. Some of them like flatter surfaces that they can land on. And they have different ways of being able to see things. Bees in particular like things that are in the blues and the purples. Butterflies tend to like flowers that are more in the reds and the oranges and the yellows. So if you have a mixture in your garden, you're going to attract more different types of pollinators. And also that if you have different types of flowers, that will attract different ones too, because they each have different likes. Not so much they don't taste any different to them. It's just how their mouth and their mandibles and how they actually get nectar and pollen off of flowers. They all have a little different mechanism for that. So it's nice to have different types of flowers in your garden. The next thing is you want to plant in blocks. Now, I see this a lot, especially in Berkeley, because we have very small gardens. And I know everyone loves to go to the garden center and go, I want one of those and one of those. And oh, I like this plant. and you don't really want to commit to having 3 or 5 or 7 of a plant because that's a lot and you have a little space and you want to have all these plants. But it's difficult for these pollinators. Imagine that you're flying along and you're looking for the plant that you want to go down and eat off of, and you just see this jumble of color and plants and you don't see anything really that catches your eye. So you have to think that you have to plant enough of a grouping. It doesn't have to be huge, but try to have something that's at least about 3 feet, maybe. If you can do 3 feet, that's great. So that they can see that. And that is a better way of getting getting them to notice your garden. And again, blocks in neighbors. If you have neighbors that you can share plants with, or that you like and you can share gardening tips with, it's nice if you can have some of the same plants in different yards, especially with our smaller yards, because they do like to hop. They fly over the fences, they go from house to house, and they do like certain things better than others. But they really like to have a diversity. And then the last thing I will say about in general is that we need to look at 4 seasons. So maybe not in upstate New York, because we don't have 4 seasons of gardening there, but here in California we do. And we need to make sure that we have things in bloom for our pollinators year round. So I really concentrate very much on the later fall, early winter, and early spring, because those are the times of the year that we tend to not have as much things blooming. Most of our perennials are more summer blooming. So I will show you some plants that will bloom over the winter time, but that's an area that I really concentrate on more, is that winter color. This is my friend Saxon Holt. He started the hashtag Life Not Lawn. And I am, again, no guilt gardening. So if you want to garden, if you want to have a lawn, that's great. Maybe you have kids, grandkids, pets, you are in a croquet league. Great. If you're going to use your lawn, you can have a lawn. But we do ask if you have room to convert some of your lawn to something that's going to be beneficial to pollinators. That's great. If you can carve out little areas for that, that's a great place to start. And if you have lawn and you're looking to introduce pollinators, just try to bring a little bit of area. You can open up some areas around your yard. If you have some lawn that you're not using, that's a great place to start to create some space to have some more pollinators. I'm getting a lot of pushback on, using what people are calling exotic plants. And I have to say that I am an organic gardener. I have a lot of natives in my garden. I am an environmentalist. I do believe that we need to be cognizant and planting natives, but we're getting a little bit caught up in the natives are the only thing that we can use. And as a scientist, when I look at climate change and I talk to entomologists and we look at how insects are actually live, that narrative doesn't jive. It doesn't go hand in hand. So what I'm hearing from people, and I'm trying to call them narratives and not myths, because it's maybe a little bit nicer, but I'm hearing that exotics provide nothing for pollinators. Well, all plants that bloom will provide something for a pollinator. Every plant's going to have a flower is going to have either nectar or pollen available to it. And whether or not that pollen or nectar is from a plant that was based in one spot of the world or the other doesn't really matter too much. It's like saying, I can't eat a bean from Mexico because the Mexican bean is going to have less nutrients than a bean grown in California. That's about the same scenario. So you have to be, a little bit more open-minded when it comes to that. I've been hearing that nectar in native plants is more nutritious than nectar in non-native plants. And again, that is there's no scientific data behind that. If you think about it, why would we have bees that live in South Africa, they eat the nectar in the plants that are in South Africa. Why would a similar insect in the United States have a different response to that? So, what we're really looking at is to make sure that we have enough plants for those, for nectar and pollen sources, because nectar is sugar. We literally make sugar water and give it to hummingbirds to eat. It's the nectar is nectar and sugar is sugar. There's really not a difference in that. Native plants are not necessarily easier to grow, and they are not all low water. We have 8,600 native plants in California. Almost 90% of them are from high rainfall areas north of the Bay Area and in the Sierras. So you cannot take a plant that is in an area that gets 60 inches of rain a year and then bring it into Palm Springs and call that a native plant. And if you're taking a plant that's 400 miles to the north of us and calling that native, then why didn't we go 400 miles to the south of us and go to Mexico and call that a native plant? So the range is really strange on that for me, because there's just no real rhyme or reason to saying that. Most of our natives, again, don't move. So I'm going to show you some pictures of native areas. And, in nature, the native plants are in a way in where they are for a reason. And as soon as you take them off that hillside or away from that creek stream or away from the soil that they're in, they may not like where they are at anymore. And traditionally in horticulture and in gardening, we've experienced a lot of death and a lot of difficulties with taking native plants out of their real native environment and trying to put them into an urban setting. So some of them are better than others, and I will go through some of those. But don't feel bad if you went out and bought a bunch of native plants and planted them in your garden and you went, oh, these are native, so I don't need to give them any special care. They're going to be great plants because they're native plants. And they didn't do so well. I have killed more native plants in my history than any of the other plants that I've killed, and I killed a lot of plants in my life. So don't feel bad about that. Native pollinators are only attracted to native plants. Again, no, they're not. The only thing that we really have to be careful of, and I really preach this, and I will talk about this more too, are the butterfly relationship is the only one that we really have to be really stringent about, because butterflies will only lay their eggs on certain plants, and there is a relationship there. And a lot of those native butterflies for us in California do have a relationship with native plants, although even that is evolving, because insects, they can evolve very quickly. They have a very quick life cycle compared to humans. This is why they become resistant to pesticides so quickly. They want to live. They really have a desire to live, and they will find ways to get around things if they have to. And we're starting to see more and more of that already. And sterile plants do actually have pollen and nectar. I get this one a lot too. People believe that a sterile plant is bad because it doesn't have any nutrients or anything for the plants. All that means is that it can't set seeds. So we actually look for sterile plants because we're trying to not create any more garden thugs. We don't want plants to escape into nature. We're trying to keep things that are appropriate and more sustainable. And part of that is having plants that don't become thuggish in the garden. So this is a picture of, this is actually Hollywood. And I like to show this because we know majority of California is actually grassland, and we don't have a lot of vegetation in grassland. So even Berkeley, when we look at old photos of Berkeley, the vegetation was up in the hills, and you see the north side of the hills where the sun is a little bit softer and they maybe get a little bit more moisture, tends to have more of the oak and the understory and more of the plantings. And when you get into areas that get more sun and had less water, there's more of the summer dry grasses. So again, it's difficult to have an all native garden that is actually native from the specific area where we're living, because once you start taking plants from Eureka and you're putting them in a garden in Berkeley, that's not really the native environment of that plant anymore. So we have to be a little bit of aware of where we are native. We are blessed in the Bay Area. We have a lot of very native oriented, from very local native nurseries, and they do sell plants that are native to our area. We have plants that are native to our area, but try going to Fresno. They only have about 200 native plants total, and almost 90% of them are summer dry grasses. So if you really wanted to take that native talk 100%, and you live in Fresno, you wouldn't have anything in your garden during the summer at all. It would be completely dormant. So, this is really, when we're talking about 100% native, this is what we're looking at. And when we are able to bring plants in from other Mediterranean summer dry climates that actually get less rainfall traditionally than we have normally, we're looking at Chile, South Africa, parts of the Mediterranean, New Zealand, Australia. those plants are sometimes better adapted for us now with climate change than some of our California natives are. We're seeing natives having more pressure in the wild and starting to become more extinct in the wild because of water issues, whereas some of the plants from other parts of the world are better adapted to the lower water conditions that we have. And for heirlooms, my family, like I said, I go back 6 generations. I'm really aware of this. This is not GMO. We're talking about old-fashioned. We're going to cross-pollinate. We're going to sow out a bunch of seedlings. We're going to do selecting work. So this is all that most of the hybrids are. The only companies that are doing nasty GMO stuff is mostly in agriculture. And there's good and bad GMO. Not all GMO is bad either, because we have to feed the world. And I think we have to feed the insects in the world. And I think take the same aspect of that. You know, if we're using GMOs to increase the crop yield by letting plants grow in saltier water or in hotter climates or in more difficult soils without having a lot of fertilizers, that's a good use of it. If we're using it so that we can spray toxic chemicals on top of wheat and corn and cotton and not have the plants die, that's probably not such a positive way of doing it. So it's not a black and white issue, but when it comes to feeding the world, we kind of need advances in breeding for vegetables. And I think we're going to be in the same spot with insects and our pollinators. Is if we have, so this plant on the top right here is an unhybridized agastache. It's actually not even that attractive to a butterfly because it's not that bright. They like brighter colors. The one on the right, on the left here, is a newer version of that plant that's been hybridized. So it blooms longer. So you, in the same square footage of your garden space, instead of having a plant that blooms for 3 or 4 weeks, you'll have a plant that might bloom 3 or 4 months, or maybe even longer than that. It's going to require the same amount of water, the same amount of space, but it's going to give you that much more bang for your buck, not only for you visually and for you to enjoy in your garden, but also for the pollinators to enjoy in your garden. This was an old ad from my family's business back in the turn of the century, and this was in Russia. And you can see on the left, they're saying, so this was the original green bean. And you see how it was all stringy, and people had to actually suck on the bean to get the bean out. You couldn't eat the whole thing. So the gentleman on the right is eating his dinner. He's all nice and clean and happy because he has green beans that he can eat without having to chew on them and spit out all the hard sides. So this is an advance that we've made in our food. We have to kind of look at it the same way with our insects, is we're creating more food for the insects by allowing them to have food that is, you know, more, like I said, more flowers, longer flowers for the same amount of time. My personal goal in life is to, I'll never eliminate petunias, but you can see in 2016, which is the last time the USDA came out, they had, just the United States, we sold $263 million worth of petunias. A tremendous amount of money. The green good industry is about $8 billion a year in sales, and the biggest chunk of that is annuals. And annuals are very intensive for chemical use, for water use, for all of the, they're just really not sustainable. And if we're going to be growing annuals, which we have fabulous annuals that we can grow, they're very easy to do from seed. So this is another category that I really encourage people to look at, annuals that are native wild seed packages. But also, you know, if you want a Cosmo or you want a marigold, or even if you want a petunia, they're super easy to do from seed. That way you can do it on your property. You don't have to worry about what's going on, you know, what's getting sprayed on them, what's coming into them. And it's a lot more sustainable. The one thing I will caution in hybridization for pollinators is this over hybridization. So we're all familiar with the florist carnation. That is probably a little bit too far. So if you can't see the pollen, then it's a good indicator that your pollinator can't see the pollen either, and they can't find the pollen. So the dianthus on the bottom right, you can see the pollen in there. You can see the stamens. That's easy to get to. They can get that. The carnation on the top, maybe not so much. And we're seeing this more in, like, this is an echinacea with the monarch. There's echinaceas now that are like triple different, and there's just all petals, and you can't see any of where the pollen would be. And I would avoid those. Those are over hybridized. It's really easy to see those. So Just kind of eyeball it. When you look at a flower, say, can I see the pollen? The easiest thing to do, the low-hanging fruit, pardon the pun, are edibles, because if we have brassicas like kale, if we have fennel or dill, rosemary, mint, those are super pollinator magnets. They're kind of like weeds if you think about it. If you look at them when they go to seed, they're a little bit weedy looking, and all of the native bees absolutely go crazy over them. These are literally buzzing in my garden when I let them go to seed. The citrus trees, all of our fruit trees, berries, it's a symbiotic relationship. We need the pollinators to pollinate them, but they love those plants. So have as many types of edibles as you can in your garden. It's a good use of water. It's a good use for your garden space, but the pollinators all love them, and just let some of them go to seed and let them use that seed for pollination too. They really love it. This is in my own garden here in Berkeley. This is Western swallowtail. We always talk about monarchs, but monarchs actually aren't super native to the Bay Area. The swallowtails are, and their host plant that they like to lay eggs on are in the wild, it's fennel. So this is another one that has actually kind of evolved with time, because the native fennel is close to dill. This is a seeded dill that I have. It's an edible dill. It's not a fennel. And I noticed in this little circle here, I don't know if you can see that, there's tiny little dot, that's their eggs. So if you see these tiny little dots on your dill or your fennel, those are from the Western swallowtail. They'll turn into these beautiful caterpillars. And then if you are like in my garden, the towhees and the blue jays and all the other birds come in and eat them. So it is the cycle of life. It is what it is. And we want to make sure that we're providing food also for our songbirds, because songbirds are also in big trouble, and we're seeing a big decline in the population. But songbirds need insects, and they specifically need insects to feed their young. They all feed their babies insects. So hummingbirds eat aphids. That's the #1 protein source. So everyone's on a big huff to try to get rid of aphids. Well, aphids actually have a purpose, because they get fed, they get picked off and fed to young birds, especially the hummingbirds. But the caterpillars also are food for the birds and the smaller when they feed their young. So, we have to allow for that when we're planting host plants for pollinators. And I always cringe because I see all this beautiful native wild fennel, and I know that there's a ton of swallowtail eggs on it. And then I see people just cutting them down and throwing them out every winter. And I feel like going and knocking on their door and saying, don't do it, leave them there. So be aware again of what's around you. And this is my favorite type of butterfly, and why I planted it. I like dill, but it's also a really easy way to get swallowtails into your garden. And I also caution against garden thugs. Sometimes they're natives and sometimes they're not natives, but I look for sterility when we're looking at plants, that they do not reseed, and this is why. This top picture is, for those of you who know what a Verbena bonariensis is, they're very often used as a perennial here in the Bay Area. It seeds like crazy. This is the garden in Sonoma. Literally millions of them come up. They were choking up everything in the garden. We want easy care gardening. We want to make sure that you're not spending a lot of time weeding. You're not spending a lot of time dealing with diseases. You want to be able to have an easier, funner existence in your garden. So be careful that you're not planting a pest. Winter, early spring. So when we're talking about plants that we can plant that are really good for that time frame, there are a lot. And in this world of cell phones now, I really encourage people to walk around their communities and their gardens and the neighborhoods and just take pictures of things that you like that are in bloom during different times of the year. And you can take those into your garden center and show them, and they can help you with that. Because I think we are really in a fabulous area. We can grow so many different things. But these are just a couple of my favorites that I'm going to show you real fast. Arctostaphylos, this is a California native. Dr. Hurd is one of the better ones as far as garden performance. So a lot of Arctostaphylos, again, These are manzanitas. There's little ones, there's ground covered ones, there's big ones, there's trees. This is a little bit of a larger specimen type. So it's a good habitat plant. Also really good for pollen and nectar early in the season, like right now. So when the bees come out of hibernation, they need to have a pollen source immediately. And we're starting to see some of our California native plants are coming because of the timing with the heat, they're not meshing up anymore. So we're having bees coming out of hibernation and the plants that they would normally go to are not blooming yet, or they've already bloomed out, or that the cycle is not always the same. So some things are caused by heat and some things are caused by temperature. And most migration, and we're talking about this a little bit with butterflies, but like the monarch migration doesn't really have anything to do with food and what type of milkweed it is. It's all about temperature. And the temperature change is what's causing them to not migrate anymore, not the fact that there is milkweed here. We've had tropical milkweed in California for over 100 years. We've never seen monarchs not migrate until like the last 10 years. So there's a lot more going on with that. And this is climate change. And so we have to be a little bit more flexible in what we're using in our gardens and things are going to change. We're going to have to relearn and refigure out some things. And the insects are going to have to do that too. Bottle brush, callistemum, this is native to Australia and New Zealand. So these are heavy winter bloomers. There's big ones, there's little ones. There's all kinds of new breeding coming out of South Africa and Australia for different colors. But this is it's a low water plant. All the birds love them, the hummingbirds love them, the pollinators love them. If you ever see these, we've got plants all around Berkeley that are probably 100 years old, but they're always covered in pollinators. Whenever they're in bloom, they bloom heavily in the winter time. This is one of the biggest pollinator plants that we have in the Bay Area. And again, it's not a native. Camellias, these are fall blooming and winter blooming camellias. But again, you can see the pollen on these. A lot of camellias are really bunchy and they have a lot of petals and you can't see the pollen. Look, if you're looking for pollinator ones, look for ones that you see the pollen in because that's how you know that they're good for pollinators. Ceanothus. I have a love-hate relationship with Ceanothus as a California native. I've killed more of these than anything else. So Ray Hartman is a little bit tougher to kill. Again, it's a little bit taller. It gets to be a little bit of a larger shrub. But if you plant a Ceanothus, pretty much count on it not lasting maybe more than 6 or 7 or 8 years. Sometimes they do better than that, but a lot of times they just aren't really long-lived. They are pretty, they actually don't live that long in the wild. They're constantly being hybridized by the birds and the bees. The birds and bees do their own pollination. So there's constantly new seedlings coming up and then they vegetate themselves that way, but they're not terribly long-lived in the garden because they're a little fussy, to be honest. California poppies, we all love them. It's a great early pollinator plant. They're easy to grow. I just throw my seed out in the fall and then I just let the rain come and then they'll come up with the rains and they just a super easy plant. This is probably one of the more important plants for us as far as a pollinator for natives. And it's the state flower. So how can you not love it? Here's a list of some larger shrubs and trees. Again, these are our winter blooming, the acacias, grevilleas, leptospermums. If you have room for an oak tree, oaks are probably the single most important plant that we can provide for pollinators. Unfortunately, they are getting sudden oak death. There's a lot of breeding work going on coming up with oak varieties that will be better for that, but we're not quite there yet. And they do take up a lot of room. So you can't necessarily plop them in a small lot, but oaks are super, super important. Ribes is a good California native, and quince. We see a lot of quince blooming around at this time of year, and the birds love the quince too. Aloes are, again, for South Africa, this is the #1 pollinator plant. And we see a lot of winter blooming aloes here in the Bay Area that are beloved by all the hummingbirds and most of the pollinators too. So this is a new variety. These are the Safari series. They're super, super heavy blooming. As you can see in this picture, they stay nice and compact. So these ones are only going to be about 2 feet tall in the landscape. They're longer blooming. Again, they'll start blooming probably October, November, and they'll bloom straight through the winter time. So you'll get a lot of bloom out of these, a lot of flower power out of them. And again, very, very low water use. We can't forget our early season bulbs. We have a lot of daffodils, snowdrops, hellebores are great, primulas are great. These are all blooming right now. They're all fabulous pollinator plants. Lavenders, I just did this today. This was in my garden. The lavenders is a Spanish lavender stochas. These and the rosemaries are going off the charts right now. Really, you plant these and you will have native bees and all types of other bees in your garden. So spring and summer, like I said, there's a lot to choose from there. You don't need to be as worried about that, but there's some new developments. Agapanthus, I'm bringing agapanthus up because I mentioned bumblebees before. Bumblebees have a really weird way of getting pollen. They call them buzzers. And what they do is they actually shake the flower and get the pollen off of it. So there's not as many flowers that bumblebees will go into. They're a larger bee, and they have certain flowers that they like to look at because of the shape of the flower. They love agapanthus. It's one of their favorite plants. There's all kinds of pictures. You can find all kinds of bumblebees on agapanthus. And since they're now on the endangered list, I'm doing actually working on an article right now on plants for bumblebees, since we need to be looking at them. They love salvias too, and they can't get into the salvia, so they'll actually bite the top of the salvia, and carpenter bees, the larger bees, do that too. If you see bees that land on the outside of the flower and actually physically bite the flower and they'll spit it out just to get to the pollen, that's what the bumblebees and the carpenter bees do. But these are new agapanthus breeding coming out of South Africa, and we get a little snobby here in California with some of our plants, like, oh, agapanthus, they're everywhere, we don't like them. So the new ones are longer blooming. In Southern California, these are blooming 4 or 5 times a year instead of just once a year. So you're getting that longer bloom cycle for the same plant. They make excellent cut flowers. They're great for hummingbirds. They're great for bees. So they are also, UC Davis just approved the series as low water use. So it's on Lucals as a low water. The larger Africanus type, what we're used to, those really big ones where all the snails would get into and we all hated them, those are not low water. So here we have a plant that we've got some that are and some that aren't in the same category. And it's just because of how the plant is and how big it gets and how it blooms. But these got UC Davis approved these as low water use. There's some great colors coming. This is a really nice series. And that's the breeder. I like to show breeders sometimes because they're people and they work. He actually seeds out about 30,000 agapanthus a year to make his selections from. He has this new bicolor. This is a few years old now, the blue and white, and he has pinks and maybe even reds coming down the horizon. So there's lots of kind of interesting things happening with agapanthus. And I like to show this because this is how you should have an agapanthus, not like 5,000 of them in a row on the side of the freeway. But anyway, you can treat them as a perennial, mix them into a mixed border like this. They do really nicely that way. So I've always had this slide when I talk about pollinators, and I left it in here, but I have to tell you, this goes back to my native talk. So they've always been saying you should plant narrow-leaf milkweed. That's the milkweed that we need to be planting in California. It's California native. I've tried a million times with this plant. I've tried it from seed. I've tried buying plants. I've had no luck. It's not actually native to our area. It's native to a little bit hotter areas. I think it might be a little bit too cold for us here. But if you really want to be, follow all the rules, this is the milkweed that people are suggesting, the native people are suggesting that we use for monarchs in specific. But they also, like you can see here, this is a swallowtail. I personally don't plant these because I am planting fennel and other things, and I'm more concerned about the swallowtails. But based on research that just has come out from the University of Davis, I knew this was coming. I was just waiting. Entomologists, they have just done a big study on the tropical milkweed, and their paper just came out, and they are saying that there's actually probably detrimental if you pull the tropical milkweed, because our population of monarchs are not migrating now, and it's not because of the milkweed, it's because of the temperatures. and the insects are here and they need to eat. So if we're not providing them with any milkweed on a year-round basis, they're actually probably not going to increase the numbers. They're actually linking the increase that we've been seeing these last few years because we've been having more food sources for them and more areas for them. So this is a controversial topic, and I realize that there's going to be a lot more information coming out on this. I'm talking about this because Marin and Ventura and some of these counties are banning the sale of tropical milkweed. You know, when monarchs do migrate into Mexico, that's what they live off of, is the tropical milkweed. So we know that they like it. We know that they eat it. We know that it's not really that detrimental to them. It's been this migration issue. When you're west of the Rockies, where we are or in California, we have a separate population than the rest of the United States. So our monarchs are different from the rest of them anyway. We've had tropical milkweed in California for over 100 years. It's never been an issue until now. So if you really love to have that in your garden, I would not feel guilty about having it. And I think that we need to be a little bit kinder to each other and not be screaming and yelling about what type of milkweed we're planting in our gardens. If your heart is in there and you want to plant them and you think you're doing a good thing, you probably are. And that's all I'm going to say about milkweed right now. Buddleias, the same thing. Buddleias are getting a bad rap. The new ones are sterile. They do not spread. They're not a weed issue. The old ones that were maybe an issue for that. But you plant a buddleia, you will have butterflies. I guarantee it. It's their absolute favorite plant. They love them. This is a California native, the wild buckwheats. These are very garden friendly. They are easy to grow. They bloom very long periods of time. They're low water use plants. They're a host plant for a number of butterflies. It's a great native plant to incorporate in gardens. I highly recommend this one. In their aster family, anything in the aster family. So these are gaillardias. You see that nice flat surface? They love to land on those. So gaillardias are fabulous. Guillaumes, this is totally tangerine. These are also, was a California native. This is a hybrid. This is shown with the lupins, which is also a California native. So it shows to show you that you can have a lot of color, a lot of texture. These are low water plants. These are all plants that are both host plants, and they have pollen and nectar for pollinators. Leucanthemum, Shasta daisies, again, that flat surface, they like to land on that, gives them something to sit on. We all like a nice cushion to sit on sometimes, right? So they're great pollinator plants. Roses, again, if you can see the pollen, so a lot of roses are very clustered and you can't see it, but if you can see the pollen on that, the one thing I will caution on roses is these are one of the plants that is sprayed the heaviest in the industry because of aphids. I don't mind aphids. I think, if we have a lot of natural pests against aphids, they're only a problem for a few weeks out of the year. You can go out there and rub them off, get your aggressions out by smushing the aphids on your roses, or you can spray them off with water, or you can just let the birds and the bees eat them because they will, or not the bees, maybe, but the birds. But be careful about, you might want to put them in quarantine for a little bit or wash them off, or let them sit someplace else and get the chemicals off of them, because unless they're locally grown, like East Bay, they bring in their own and they grow their own there. This is a good one to ask a question, especially if you're going into a large box store, is where did the rose come from and what has it been treated with? All salvias are good. There is not a salvia in the world that's bad. Killer cranberry was bred locally here by Lewin Miller of Monterey Bay Nursery, so I have a little fondness of that, but seriously, you can never go wrong with a salvia. The fall, again, this is an area we need to bump up again. We don't have a lot going on. So in fall, yes, eucalyptus. So there's a lot of different smaller varieties that aren't quite as big and invasive. Mahonias are great. We have a great one in our collection, soft caress, but they're nice fall blooming. This is a California native aster. So this is a nice little aster to have for fall blooming. Lagostromias, crepe myrtles. This is a really big pollinator plant. So a lot of times, again, people come to me, oh, you should not be promoting Lagostromias. Or when Bayer did a survey on bees, because they're a big chemical company, so they have money to put into surveys. This was the #1 plant for beehives, for the bees are bringing back, was the pollen from Lagostromias and crepe myrtles. Passifloras are great. They're a host plant for the Gulf fritillera, which is interesting because it's not native here. And yet when I planted a passiflora in my garden, they showed up. So they obviously are around somewhere. I had to Google what butterfly went with this plant to figure out what it was. New vitexes. So the old vitexes were not sterile and they were weedy and we didn't want them. The new ones are sterile. So again, this is a situation where these are bumblebees in there. Bumblebees like vitex. They're extremely low water. They're a great structural plant for summer, but they used to be weedy. Now these new ones are sterile. And so now they can go into our gardens. We don't have to worry about them becoming bugs. Pecomerias, again, they bloom almost year round for us in the Bay Area, and all kinds of birds and hummingbirds and butterflies and bees. They all love these types of tubular flowers. They really like those. So these new Pecomerias that come in different colors, they're more compact. They're really easy to take care of. They're low water. And I always like to end on a positive note. I like to show some of what you can do really easily. This was what I had to work with in Sonoma at the Cornerstone. So that's what we started with. And that's what where we're at a year later. So these are all low water plants. There's a lot of pollinators in here. This garden is alive. And when you're in this garden, there's hummingbirds and bees and butterflies are all through here. It's just remarkable what that little space turned into from a really kind of sterile environment to that. And this is another little garden I did there. So this is only an 8x8 square. So you can have a very, very small space. And that was it when about 6 months later, and then that was it a year later. So even in a very small footprint, you can have a pretty low water, high pollinator, really beautiful. You can get cut flowers. You can have some edibles in there. You can do a lot of things in a very small space, and you can still be low water. You can still be very sustainable. You can still have all your native pollinators, and you can enjoy your garden. And that's really what I want for you, is to enjoy your space, enjoy your garden, be able to be out there and enjoy it. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, and we are now opening to questions.
Janet, thank you so much. As always, your talks are a learning experience and enjoyable, and your photos are gorgeous. Several people have put great questions out there. Molly, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself, or shall I read it out to Janet?
About sunset.
Yes, that one, but I thought your one about how to tell whether there were insects using your yard was a great one.
Yeah, Janet, how do you know if there's stuff going on in your leaf mold or if nothing's going on? Like, how can you see or tell if there's things nesting or overwintering?
Well, that's the challenge, right? Is there a lot of these bees are tiny. We're talking, maybe a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, and you probably won't see them. You might only see them coming out of the ground. I often see bees this time of year, maybe now, maybe not this year because we've had so much rain, but once it starts to warm up, if you're just kind of in your garden, you can actually see them coming up out of the ground. So I assume that they're there because we have a pretty healthy and active native bee population here in Berkeley. We have a great resource in the Berkeley Botanical Garden. They have a bee lab up there, which I encourage everyone to go and visit if you want to see and read more about our native bees. But we have them. They're here, and if you have a space for them, they're gonna be there. They're gonna find it. So I always assume that they're there, even though I don't necessarily see them because they can be really small. And the solitary bees, that's it. That's just the one bee. So they lay eggs, and there'll be more that come out of there. But it's not like a hive where there's a whole mess of them in one spot.
Janet, why don't you stop screen sharing, and then we can see the gallery of participants? Even though that's a gorgeous picture.
Let me see. Let me see if I can do this.
And then maybe Margie, if you would unmute yourself. I thought your question was a great one as well.
Oh, hi. Thank you. This is so helpful and interesting. I was wondering if the compost that is readily available down at the Berkeley Marina, that I understand is from waste management, if that is acceptable to use in light of this new information about the neonicotinoids. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because I'm just thinking people put all sorts of stuff in their green bins and fertilizers and pesticides and
and
stuff.
plastics and
Yeah.
metal. And so I have stopped using that. I used it once. And I've also stopped using bulk compost that I bought from a local source because I found batteries in it. And it was sold under an organic compost. So I'm the lazy composter. I have about a 3 by, it's about 6 feet long by maybe 3 feet wide. I just have 2 piles, and I'm pretty much producing my own. I'm pretty much self-sufficient on my compost now, and I just take all of my kitchen waste that I have. I drink organic coffee, so I have a lot of coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are great for our compost piles. And I just kind of like, I'll throw everything in one pile for a year, and then I'll put a little bit of leaf mold over it on top of it, and I'll let it sit, and I'll start another one. And by the end of the year, it's completely composted and full of worms and ready to go. And I'm not turning it. I'm not out there going, oh, I need to have a layer of brown and then a layer of green. And they've made everything so complicated. We live in a perfect place to compost because we're not that hot, humid summer. I think those climates, they might have more issues with that. But it's super easy for us to compost here, and I don't do anything, and I have beautiful compost. If I have to augment it, it's so expensive and I hate doing it, but I do use the local, if I go to like East Bay, they have bagged compost that I trust because it's gone through a process. They've actually screened it and everything, but the local municipal compost, I hate to say it. Yeah, it's just whatever anyone throws in their green waste bin, and people aren't very good about that. They put all kinds of garbage in there.
Janet, you haven't had trouble with varmints in your compost? I gave up my pile because it was like rat city.
So I can't grow any vegetables in my backyard because the rats will eat they ate like 6-foot green beans down to the ground overnight when killed me. But they don't bother my compost. And I have to say that I do. It's mostly things that they're not going to be interested in. And if I do have something in there that I'm afraid of, I kind of bury it in there a little bit. I make sure that it's completely covered up. But I kind of feel like there are rats everywhere in Berkeley. I don't have my compost pile in the front by my house. It's in the very back of the yard. But I haven't noticed it. They don't dig in it. I don't see anything in that. I really don't. But I don't put any, no meat products, no. I do put my eggshells in there, but I don't put anything, as long as you don't put any meat or anything in there, they usually leave it alone.
Mhm. Anthony points out also that there's PFAS residue as well as the neonic stuff in in Milwaukee, we used to call it sewage sludge.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that compost they're just dumping down in the Berkeley Marina, people shouldn't be using it. Like, what's the point then?
I really wish that they would do a better job of screening. I don't know what to say because I've gotten it several times, and I've always found, seriously, like metal, plastic, bits of glass, bits of things in there. And so it does make you wonder what else is in there that you're not seeing. And honestly, I also get a lot of weeds out of it. I used it the first time I used it, I got a nice crop of weeds out of that. So I don't think it's getting really heated up enough to kill the weed seeds that are in there. And a lot of people are they throw oxalis in there, so you get oxalis weeds and you get all kinds of stuff in there. So I wish they had a better way of making the compost, but as long as, it's a catch-22. I mean, I don't know who would want to use it. We want to be able to use it because it's there and it's sustainable, but I don't want it in my garden, to be perfectly honest.
That's grim. What's going to happen to it if it's kind of undesirable?
Well, if I had my 2 cents worth, the city of Berkeley would use it on median strips and sow wildflowers and natives and stuff and get rid of the grass that has to be watered and mowed and
Absolutely. And that's something that, they're doing such a great job of this in Europe. In the United States, they're spraying all the highway medians with Roundup, which is all going into our groundwater, and they're killing everything because they're afraid of fires, but there's other ways to mitigate that. In Europe, they're actually planting all of the highway medians, and they're planting them with wildflowers specifically for pollinators. And it's an opportunity that we would have here. If you think about how many thousands of miles of roadways we have just in California, and what we could do if we actually would plant that with something useful instead of spreading nasty chemicals on everything.
Colleen reminds everybody about using wire screening to keep rodents out of garden spots and compost piles.
Yes. See, the pollinator corridors, that's exactly what we're talking about, is having having long spaces for them to live in. I see someone else shares my pain with the narrow leaf milkweed.
Arlene has a truly lovely garden. Anybody else have some comments, questions, suggestions?
I think we have Anthony raising his hand.
Yeah, I have a comment. I kind of, Janet, agree with you on the native invasive kind of thing. I think some of them are helpful. Some of the invasive plants or non-native plants can overtake areas, but I'm a beekeeper. And so where I am in New York, there are a few invasive plants like Japanese knotweed, which was brought over in the early 1900s as a landscaping plant, but the bees love it, and it produces honey that's like buckwheat honey, and a lot of people like it, but our environmental conservation state agency, they're doing everything they can to eradicate it. And so, as beekeepers, we're always kind of, they want us to report when we come across it, but for some reason, I think we have amnesia and we don't remember where we saw it. And so, but, I do agree that with the way climate change is and the changing of the phenology of plants and insects, some of these non-natives are going to play a major role, I think, in helping the insects survive, at least in the areas where they are, or else they're going to have to move to whatever climate is more satisfying for them. So.
Yeah, it's kind of the brave new world out there. And we're all, in a way, home scientists. If what we see in our own landscapes and our own gardens is relevant, and we can see what flowers the bees are going to and which ones they aren't, and we can make our own observations in our own gardens.
Yeah, when you had talked about walking around and just looking in your neighborhood as to what's there, I would suggest that people, if they have phones, not only take pictures, but to use like iNaturalist and Seek to help them identify, those, what they're seeing. And it's more enjoyable, and then you're really being a citizen scientist, because you can actually report. We have programs in our state where there are certain invasive insects affecting a lot of the trees, and so they're using those techniques to report them for eradication programs when it is necessary. I mean, we're losing the ash tree.
Right.
It's almost decimated. And so, we do want to keep some trees around. So, we're more willing to report on things like that.
Yeah.
Malin or Malin? I think that's a moral question, but why don't you ask Janet her opinion?
Hi. Yeah, so I was just curious in general, what happens if you just throw a few poppy seeds or fennel seeds wherever you go? I mean, not at your neighbor's backyard or front yard, but when you hang out at a playground or there's some public spaces, and it's yeah, so it is a moral question, and that's why I haven't done it. Okay,
Oh, so
I'm gonna
you
mute myself again.
you want to be a Johnny Appleseed and throw, I would applaud that. I think the more California poppies we have anywhere, the better. And if they are happy, they'll come up and bloom, and that's great. I don't see any problem with that at all.
Thanks, love it.
Well, if there are no further questions, I want to once again thank Janet and Patricia for putting this all together, and I invite everybody to join us at the Berkeley Garden Club anytime. We are always happy to invite you to be a guest to one of our talks, and perhaps you'll decide to become a member.
Thank you.
And any last questions? This is your opportunity.
I had a question about Sunset as a company.
Yes.
Like, what is the part of Sunset that's doing the plants, and then Sunset Magazine seems to have evaporated?
So Sunset Magazine was sold to a private investment group. They got, when Time Inc. sold their magazine portfolio to Meredith, they spun Sunset off for some reason. And so the magazine itself went through a very tumultuous time. It's kind of coming back. I'm happy to report they actually have staff and they're coming out with the magazine again after a while of not doing that. I worked really closely with Kathy Brenzel and Julie Chai and the editorial staff there. We had a very close relationship. And I'm trying to rebuild that up again now with the new management. But in theory, we work with them, but they're a separate entity. So we were in the middle. I mean, the biggest thing it was the garden book, right? I mean, we were in the middle of coming up with the new garden book when that happened, and we're still kind of trying to negotiate that and see what happens with the Western Garden book, because that is all in limbo too. So it was just a kind of an unfortunate and weird episode, but I think that we're climbing out of it. And part of the reason we have a plant collection is for a revenue stream. We do get a percentage of the sales on that, and it helps to fund garden content. And
who owns the company now? Just a venture capital.
Yeah,
I know they sold the Menlo Park flagship property.
yes, all the gardens there got sold. It was very sad. It was a legacy property, and
and all the recipes too, all the intellectual property of
all the intellectual
food.
Property. Yeah. We've seen this happen over and over again in publishing. I mean, the LA Times, the same thing happened to them. They got bought and they sold the LA Times building downtown LA. And our sister magazine, Southern Living, they did the same thing. They sold and so it's all these big corporations, they were trying to get as much money out of everything that they could. And what the magazines had were legacy properties that were worth a lot of money. I mean, the Menlo Park facility sold for $77 million.
Ugh,
and then they made their money, and then they sold it.
Bulldozed it. Yeah.
So
Happening in many industries, unfortunately.
yeah, it's tragic. It really is. I mean, then, I grew up with Sunset. I'm born and raised in California. My mother, it was the only magazine we had in the house. It's very painful to see what's happened.
So I always encourage people, if they ever run across the latest edition of the Sunset Western Garden book, which was 2012, to buy it up. it was really the last of our Western encyclopedias of plants. And even though it's 10 years, 10, 11 years old now, it still is a treasure.
It is, and I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to do a new one. But it won't be, you're gonna pull it up. It won't be anytime soon.
Wait, no, let's see, what am I gonna
For
do?
those of you who aren't old Bay Area gardeners, if you do see one in a used bookstore, as Patricia said, grab it.
2012. Yeah, I ran out and bought a used one, but Patricia told me. I didn't realize that they stopped making them, but I guess it makes sense.
Yep, that's the
Yep,
one.
That's the one.
But what I use almost as often is, now I can
Oh,
show
there it
this.
is. Yeah.
uh,
So that was my garden in Menlo Park.
Ah,
Okay, there, maybe you can see this without the glare.
Oh, yeah.
I love this.
yeah.
So that
That's
was a
still in
sunset
print,
book.
Janet?
Pardon?
That's still in print?
It's not in print. You can probably find it used. But
Okay.
it's all the Sunset Publishing is out of print.
I have on my desk back here, I have 6 copies, Beth.
Oh,
You're,
wonderful.
you're welcome to one of them.
I will buy that from you.
Right.
That would be great. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out, as it were, on a gray and stormy night. Thank you for our visitors from the far reaches. And once again, the Albany Community Center has much to offer, as does the Berkeley Garden Club. And it's wonderful to see everybody here this evening. Thank you, Patricia, for arranging Janet's speech. And thank you, Kanan, for managing all of our technology yet again. So April 11th, I don't remember whether I don't know if I spelled her name properly in the notes, but Elizabeth Bogle is going to be our next speaker.
Yeah. So we'll see you all.
We'll see everybody on the 11th.
Yes.
Janet, thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for coming out.
We hope we'll see you back at the Garden Club for another wonderful talk.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night, all.